Okay, welcome back. We're talking about reaction formation. And so, what are the concept of reaction formation is the basic idea that it is developing a different set of rules to live your life by that go against conventional societal rules that have essentially let you down. You know, you're people from argues that people from the lower classes are expected to live up to these middle class life standards, and when they fail to do so, the middle class looks down upon them. It creates a lot of hostility and resentment. And one way of dealing with that is what Cohen calls reaction formation. Okay, in other words, people um, they act out in ways that essentially allows them to get some release of like a boiler getting ready to bust. And you open the valve and the hot air shoots out of it, gives it some release, some relief. And so, where's the concept of reaction formation still present today? Where can we see people who get frustrated by a system that is failing them and they kind of not freak out, but they just kind of they need a sense of release, and so and they and they get swept up in moments. So let's take a look for both. So here's one. This is an image from a Trump rally in 2016, and you can see in my snarky comment, these are not Highland Park Republicans. You know, most of my family are pretty conservative, but you wouldn't see them wearing this shirt that says "F your feelings." Um, you know, my dad, who was a lifelong Republican, rest his soul, would never do this to anyone in public. These are just things that middle class people just don't do, right? And so this is a form. You know, many people argue that the excitement and the hostility generated at these rallies is a form of reaction formation. Um, so let's take another look. This is the Huey Newton Gun Club up in Dallas, and their way of sort of dealing with the stress of being black and dealing with racism is to essentially take back the streets, and they gather up they exercise their Second Amendment rights. They gather up their weapons and they march in streets in Dallas. And does it make white people uncomfortable? Yes, it does. And the more uncomfortable it makes them, the more release and more relief that these guys get from the dealing with uh, all of the issues in society. And so let's talk a little bit about the riots. So I, and I can't take credit for this idea, but a number of sociologists have argued that riots in some ways are very functional. They have what's called a latent function for society, an unintended but relatively positive consequence. Riots have been the force of social change, particularly in the civil rights era. Um, and riots also serve as a relief valve or a release valve to get some relief from. It's a reaction formation, in other words. And so what riots do is they allow people to vent their frustration without toppling governments. Okay, so we deal with some property damage, we deal with some violent behavior in the short run, but our system stays relatively stable in the long run, as opposed to countries where riots are just the first step towards a dealing with a totalitarian regime, and it becomes the first step towards an outright revolution. Um, so we've seen, people's relief valves, this reaction formation comes in two ways. It can come in peaceful ways, and here is an example of people engaging in peaceful protest in the summer of 2020. This is a scene from New York. But also we know that it also manifested in violent ways. And here's a scene of a New York PD police car being burned in the summer of 2020 after a major battle between protesters and the police. Um, it's not the first. Like I said, our history is pretty replete uh, with riots. And so here's an image from Ferguson, Missouri, in 2014, a building that had been burned during the riots there. The LA riots of 1992 were awful, and it was a lot of damage was done. At the time, I think it was the largest loss of property in the United States history. And this is an image from the riots in 1968. 1968 was a terrible summer in the United States in terms of political and social unrest. Riot after Dr. King was assassinated, riots started in April and extended throughout the summer. There was a bad one at the Democratic National Convention that year. And so people ask, well, gosh, why do people engage in this and burn their own neighborhoods down? And so that's evaluating this activity from a very middle class perspective. Okay, but if you flip the page here, or if you flip the coin, let's say, look at the other side of this, that what we really see here is a version of reaction formation. These are people who are frustrated, and they are sickened by the system that continues to disappoint them and at the time oppress them legally. And they had killed their hero, Dr. King, and so they felt like they really didn't have anything to lose. And so they burnt down the blocks in which they lived, and they burnt some businesses, and that was a terrible thing to do. That was a criminal act for sure. But the entire process of the riot was a sort of a release of frustrations that had built up, particularly, and it culminated with the assassination of Dr. King. And so, again, 1968, a terrible time. But what it did, it had a latent function in the sense that it got people talking about these issues, and it got more civil rights legislation moving forward, and more sort of more legislation that seemed to at least attempt to improve the lives of the people who lived in these places. Okay, let's move on from here. All right, so that's Cohen's theory, and covered and it's one of my favorites. And we'll come back to some ideas throughout the rest of the semester that still ring true, I think, with Cohen. But some of the critiques of his theory, and then one is that it doesn't really explain why delinquent boys transition into corner boys. In other words, why do the Matt Dillons who are just jackassing around and wasting their lives, why do they all of a sudden, accept a job at the gas station and just kind of live life as best they can until they die, and they don't really get in trouble anymore? It doesn't explain that. We've talked a little bit already that we tend, as sociologists, tend to think about you can't ignore the aging aspect of criminal behavior, right? Matt Dillon at 20 years old doing that and aggravating the high school girls, etc. You can see Matt Dillon doing it at 50 years old is just flat out creepy, okay, and probably be arrested for it. All right, number two, it doesn't explain the existence of middle class gangs. Yeah, I don't know. I've seen this critique show up time and again. If someone can find me a good solid middle class gang, then I'll buy the theory. But right now, I really don't. Number three is that it's a bit dated, but okay, it was dated in the 90s. And one of the reasons why it was dated in the 1990s, because most gangs at the time in the 1990s were what we call for-profit gangs, and they were heavily involved in the drug trade. And these are some of the most infamous gangs we know about. The Crips and the Bloods were for-profit gangs. The some of the other major gangs in Chicago were involved in for-profit drug trade. The Gangster Disciples were a big gang in Chicago. The Vice Lords were a big gang in Chicago. The Rolling 60 Crips were a big gang. The original sort of Crip gang, big for-profit gang involved in the drug trade. Problem is today, most gangs that are not Latino gangs are not involved in drugs anymore because, well, for one thing, they were involved in primarily in crack trade. And even among drug users, people have realized that crack will mess you up. And people don't do crack anymore. Some do, but most people don't do crack. There are other drugs out there. And the number one drug today that's traded for profit among these gangs that we're talking about from the 1990s, like the Gangster Disciples and the Crips and the Bloods, is marijuana. And marijuana is a low-profit drug. In fact, you barely make any money off of selling marijuana on the street. So the profit gang critique doesn't really apply anymore. We still think the core ideas of resentment and hostility and reaction formation are quite useful. And I think we'll get to the chapter, when we get to the discussion of the book on Chicago and why so much violence there today, you will see these same themes will essentially float straight to the top of the concoction, because the ideas of resentment, hostility, and reaction formation are probably some of our best explanations for what we see in violence, gangs in Chicago today in 2020 compared to 1995, which was gang violence related to open-air drug markets. Let's move on and talk quickly about differential opportunity theory. Cloward and Olin, this is a really interesting idea. They really sort of take Cohen's ideas and move them in a new direction. And so what they argue is that all delinquent behavior is directed, whereas Cohen sort of thought delinquent behavior was aimless and pointless. You know, the Matt Dillon, creeping on Diane Lane in the movie, and, petty theft, stealing stuff, vandalism, that kind of crap. Cohen and Olin Cloward and Olin are like, no, delinquent behavior is directed. And they borrow a lot from Merton's work. So when you're looking at the conforming opportunity structure, okay, what is there? If people are being raised in a neighborhood where there is a good conformist opportunity structure, in other words, good schools, good neighborhoods, available jobs, activities for kids to be involved in, then there's going to be low opportunity for people to get involved in illegitimate opportunities. So again, if we think crime is learned, and as sociologists we believe that criminal behavior is learned behavior, then the only way to learn to be a criminal is through an apprenticeship. In other words, there's no criminal school, there's no college of the criminal, how to be a money launderer. There's no school there. You got to learn through an apprenticeship. In other words, you got to work with people who know how to do this stuff. So in order to understand crime and to be good at it, you have to look at what illegitimate opportunities are available to delinquents. So what these guys argue is that illegitimate opportunities are available in local neighborhoods, and what types are there will shape the subculture that's going to develop. And so they argue that there are three basic types of subcultures that developed. There are what's called criminal gang subcultures, there are conflict gang subcultures, and then lastly there are retreatist gang subcultures. Okay? Criminal gangs, conflict gangs, retreatist gangs. We're going to go through all three of these. So if you live in a neighborhood where there are no gangs or no illegitimate opportunities, chances are you're not going to learn to be a good criminal. But if you live in a neighborhood, let's say, that has criminal gangs, then this could be an opportunity for you. You could get into that apprenticeship that you need to become a good criminal. So, best movie to describe criminal gang neighborhoods is Goodfellas. If you've never seen Goodfellas, get on Netflix or YouTube or whatever you have to do and watch it. It is a true story about how a kid, started at like 12. Hold on. Police, ironically enough, just went down Franklin Avenue. I live on Austin Avenue out on my patio, which backs up against Franklin Avenue, which isn't really. Austin Avenue is a nice place, but Franklin Avenue, not so much. All right. Criminal gangs, what are they? They are basically what we think about in terms of old school mafia. All right. Neighborhoods that have highly organized criminal gangs have a subculture in which there is a network of connections among lawyers, gang members, corrupt police officers. It is every mafia movie you've ever seen rolled into one neighborhood. It is good. Again, I think Goodfellas is the best. The Godfather is a great movie, but it's really everybody who watches The Godfather kind of comes out going, I could be a gangster. Goodfellas you watch and you kind of go like, the gangster life may not be for me. Because it seems like everybody winds up dead or in prison, which is true. So anyhow, criminal gangs emerge in neighborhoods. They're highly organized. It's sort of like your old school mafia. In criminal gangs, you have older criminals that serve as role models, like Paulie and Goodfellas, and the whole subculture revolves around this idea of how do we make money through basically illegal sources of income. And one of the great things about Goodfellas is you see when one of their these are the guys who robbed Lufthansa. And if you don't know what it is, just kind of Google Lufthansa heist. It'll tell you the whole backdrop of the movie. But in the early part of the movie, you see them stealing trucks of goods. So they'll steal a truck full of a cigarette shipment and then turn around and sell those cigarettes on the street for half price. Or they'll intercept a shipment of TVs and then turn around and sell those TVs on the street for half price. It's pure profit, right? Because they stole the things. It's a subculture that just revolves around yielding illegal sources of income, and they'll get it from wherever. Another great movie is Donnie Brasco, which is also a true story. And in the movie, their guys they're kind of organized in tightly knit cells, and their cell is required. Their cell answers to a capo, and the capo has to turn in a certain amount of money each week to the don or the mafia boss. And so the soldiers, on the street who answer to the capo, they go out and get money however they can. They'll just steal it from people. And in one scene, you see these guys, they're cutting the heads off of parking meters and they're back in the mafia social club, shaking the quarters out of them in order to make the vig payment to the capo that week. I mean, it's just that kind of stuff. They'll rob banks, they'll steal jewels and heist them, and they'll also cut off parking meter heads to take quarters out of them. Any way they can make a buck and pay off their vig, they're going to do it. All right. Classic mafia, Goodfellas, criminal gangs. Second type of conflict gangs, and this is what we think of, is traditionally thought of as Crips and Bloods. All right. In unstable neighborhoods, it's there isn't high levels of criminal organization like you would find in a mafia. It's just kind of these are in the 1990s. These were streets that were what we called open air drug markets, where when you needed drugs, you would drive into a neighborhood, roll up onto a street corner, hand a guy some money, the guy would hand you some drugs, and hope you got out of there without getting killed. Okay, that was open air street markets. They were highly violent because rival gangs in the neighborhoods. That's how drugs who came into this country. That's how we distributed to buyers. Rival gangs would fight for territory, and if I caught you selling drugs on my side of town, there was an issue of dispute resolution. If I caught you selling drugs on my side of town, I can't take you to court and sue you. If Exxon and Chevron get in a dispute about mineral rights on offshore drilling, they have teams of lawyers who fight it out in courts for years. Two street gangs, if the Crips and the Bloods are fighting over a street corner who's going to sell drugs, you can't take them to court. There's no drug court where you go, oh, okay, well, let's settle this drug selling dispute. No, that's illegal activity. You can't call the cops because your drug dealer cheated you. You're going to take it out with revenge. You're going to get a gun and go out and shoot them. And so that was a lot of life in the 1990s during open air drug markets. So these conflict gangs in these neighborhoods have a code, and in the chapter that two chapters I had you read in Code of the Street, toughness, securing turf, respect. These are the big things you saw, right? Toughness and respect. You had to be ready to fight anybody at a given moment because that was a challenge to your toughness. And if you lost that toughness, if you backed down from a fight, that means you were weak. And if you're weak, they don't want anything to do with you. Even if you lose the fight, you take an ass beating, that's fine. You have to show that you're tough, okay? And you have to show respect. I mean, people get shot over issues of respect. So essentially, conflict gangs, it's argued that they emerge in neighborhoods where there's neither the conventional opportunities, like good schools, opportunities for jobs, etc. The mafia doesn't want conflict gangs in their neighborhoods. They want their neighborhoods well run and safe. Now they're running criminal enterprises out of there, but they're not going to put up with conflict gangs, street gangs showing up in mafia neighborhoods. Okay, so they tend to form in what's considered to be tough neighborhoods. So we've talked about the Crips and the Bloods, the Germantown neighborhood in Philly, Chicago. The Vice Lords and the Gangster Disciples ran that city for a long time, and it was about they were basically stationed in the housing projects there. The gangs were, and each housing project had basically its own affiliation, and they were selling drugs in the housing projects and outside of the housing projects and at other spots around town. Those gangs were what we call profit gangs. They were organized like corporations. They had leaders who ran them. They had punishments for people who violated the laws. So one other thing is, if you were a gang member, if you're a gangster disciple and you were ordered to go and kill somebody and you messed up, you didn't do it, or maybe you killed him, but you also killed a little kid at the same time, you would have to use the argot of the gang, violated. In other words, you had to be punished, usually in a physical way. One of the primary ways of punishing or violating gang members who did something wrong was to break their jaw. And so if you screwed up as a member of the Gangster Disciples, you accidentally shot a kid while you were shooting somebody else, you had to be violated. Not that they had a lot of value for the kid's life, but because your killing of the kid brought police attention to the gang. You shoot another drug dealer, police aren't getting involved, honestly. They'll show up and do an investigation. They don't see it as a major thing. But if in the commission of that crime you also killed an innocent bystander, then the police are going to put a lot of heat on the gang. So those old school gangs were organized very hierarchically, and they had a lot of their leaders who didn't really do the dirty work, and they had foot soldiers who did the dirty work, and they continuously recruited young kids or young men into the gangs to do the dirty work, because they always needed foot soldiers. Retreatist gangs are not new, but they're reemerging. And so retreatist gangs are those that people call them double failures. They've been unsuccessful in other types of gangs. They typically have no organization. They have loose affiliation. There might be some neighborhood affiliation for retreatist gangs. Outlaw motorcycle gangs are oftentimes referred to as retreatist gangs, or at least they're sort of the initial retreatist gangs. Many retreatist gangs are sort of focused on drug use, sexual deviance, alcohol abuse, etc. Some people argue that it's a subculture more than a gang, but what we've seen and what we'll see when we finish this book on Chicago is that, well, retreatist gangs are reemerging. And if you look at the inner city life in Chicago today, if you look at the South Side, especially among black street gangs, the traditional black street gangs in Chicago have dissolved after the crack became essentially a non-profitable drug anymore. And right now the profitable drugs are cocaine and meth. Meth is made some in Mexico, some in the United States. Cocaine all comes from Colombia through Mexico, and it's distributed by the cartels. Well, the cartels have their own networks. They don't use street gangs in Chicago to distribute cocaine, and so there's little money to be made in the drug trade anymore. So what's happened is that these gangs have kind of dissolved into like streets, block by block, loose associations of people, some of whom might have been in rival gangs at one point in their life. We'll talk more about it when we get to the book, but retreatist gangs are now reemerging in Chicago, and they're made up largely of young black men, and it's at these retreatist gangs in Chicago where we are seeing the highest levels of violence. And when we see these reports on the TV about we had a record murder weekend in Chicago and 16 kids were shot in the South Side or West Side, it is largely these retreatist gangs. It is not the old school Gangster Disciples and Vice Lords that are killing people. Frankly, those gangs don't exist anymore. It is these sort of loose former gang members that have kind of got nothing to do. They can't even sell drugs to make a living anymore. They've kind of just dropped out of society. And, they kill each other over the dumbest stuff. We'll get there in a few chapters. All right, we're going to stop here.